Hi, everybody. Welcome to Virtual Thursdays Dire Literary Series. And tonight I'm so excited to have author, Professor Tricia Barker joining us. And let me tell you a little bit about Tricia. We'll let the screen do this. You're going to know all about Tricia and her book and her broadcasts. You just go to Tricia Barker, NDE, near-death-experience.com, and people like to be read too. Tricia Barker experienced a profound near-death experience during her senior year of college, and this experience guided her to teach overseas in public schools and at the college level. Her NDE story has been featured in I Survived, Beyond and Back, Season 1, Life to Afterlife, Death and Back, National Geographic Magazine, Simple Grace Woman, Women's World Magazine, Coast to Coast AM, etc., etc. And that's how I found Tricia, by watching TV. She's a graduate of the University of Texas. She received her MFA in creative writing from Goddard College. She is a professor, author, medium, and theta healer. And she also has a YouTube channel that she interviews other near-death experiencers. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Now, we chatted a little bit. We did a little pre-interview by email, and it's very, but like, you know, the elephant in the room is your near-death experience. So we'll open with that. So you were 18 years old. First of all, I think most people know what a near-death experience is, so I don't need to define it. But just tell me, first of all, like what your injuries were that occurred from your car accident.
Yeah, so I was 21, about to graduate from college, and I had a head-on collision mostly, and it broke T10, 11, 12, part of 13. And so lots of vertebrae were fractured and they were pushing into the spine and causing a lot of pain and a lot of immediate like numbness in my left leg as well.
And do you still have pain in those areas, or?
You know, they don't know. Doctors don't know the lifelong repercussions of basically having all this metal in your body. So certainly yoga helps me stay out of some pain. And I have all kind of shamans and chiropractors and different people who work on me, you know, to keep me out of excessive pain. But yeah, I mean, my back is probably aging quicker than most people's.
All right, so when you came out of this, what was your first thoughts? And did you want to come back into your body? Because I've heard a lot of people saying that they didn't want to come back.
Yeah, so one of the like depressing parts of a beautiful near-death experience is the limited nature of consciousness within the body. So, you know, when you have been outside of your body, as I was, and I was agnostic at the time of this experience. So I had basically left the religion I grew up in, and I preferred academia, and I preferred, you know, just science and fact-based information. But the minute I was outside of my body, I understood that consciousness goes on, that we are so much more than our bodies. Consciousness is located in our bodies, but we are so much more. And there are higher beings, you know, there's so much love out there that I think that's the hardest part. You know, when I got closer to God, in a sense, if you want to call this God, creator, you know, the universal light, whatever, God consciousness, I knew that there was a creator and I was created, and I was part of this creator, but I was a creation. And it was humbling to be so loved and to not take any of that pain of earth with me. So of course, coming back to the body, oh yeah, there was a lot of disappointment to be just me, if that makes sense.
So that's a real, like, it's a lot of hope for people to know that there's something out there. But did you also get the experience of receiving intellectual information while like the knowledge of everything?
Yeah, so a lot of near-death experiencers have this sense of oneness with everything. And, you know, it takes a long time to integrate a full near-death experience, because especially without a lot of spiritual practice, because our consciousness has to understand it on many levels and let it play out in life. But About 10 years after the accident and near-death experience, I started talking to researchers, and researchers were very interested in the verifiable details. So the small things like my stepdad getting a candy bar and how this was verified by a family member. This became a big part of what researchers were interested in. Now, as far as intellectual knowledge, it was more intuition comes in more as like a deep knowing. And some of the messages are quite simple, but I knew that there was a reason why the creator of all that is told me to go into teaching. And careers that focus on service end up healing us in some ways. And so there were a lot of things that I still needed to heal after a near-death experience, everything from being bullied to a suicide attempt I made in college to childhood abuse, and seeing this play out in my students' lives and helping them in certain ways. I just was downloaded that information of how to help. And I think that I didn't know that, but it kind of came out of me through readings and through really just connecting with students. So I felt prepared, and I felt like something greater than me was working through me when I was helping students. Now, of course, I followed the protocols, took students to counselors and all that, of course, but still there's important moments that get translated from a safe adult to a younger person, just on that walk to a counselor.
Well, you've taught middle school, you've taught high school, you're college professor. So what do you prefer in terms of what people are going through? Who do you find that are more interesting for you to work with? And do any of them ask about you?
That's an interesting question. I think you make the most difference in the lives of younger students, to be honest. Like, I felt like there were many students who were pivotal that I encountered when working in the junior high atmosphere. So what I mean by they were pivotal is like their lives were about to veer off into some really dark areas that it would be hard to pull them back from later. Sociopathy, psychopathy, some really like some deep stuff. But when you reach a kid at 14 or 15 and bring them back into this world of feeling, this world of interacting with people, this world of really being examined by the community, I think some healing occurs. Not in all students, but certainly in some. And I didn't back down. So the junior high students, that 3 of them burned down a church. So it was this vandalization that they did, and they were sent to a little area behind the school with a police officer. All the teachers just ignore them. But I went out there every day and I said, guess what? I'm not sending your materials to you through the police officer. I have some self-help books for you. And all of English class now is just to examine yourself. And I'm going to respond to you. And we're going to have this back and forth conversation about why you do the things you do, where it came from, and we're going to do deep self-analysis. One of those girls wrote me back several years later, and she's like, look, I got into University of North Texas. That exercise really helped me turn my life around. She said, sorry to report the other 2 girls are still on drugs, but I'm really happy that I changed my life. So, that's one example of,
You kept your
just
side
that
of the street
attention
clean.
that can help.
Uh,
So at
you
the college level, there's a whole lot of processing trauma, which really is just with adults as well. So I think maybe I made the biggest difference in junior high kids, but you still make a difference at all levels.
Okay, we got some questions in the chat. So how did your near-death experience change your outlook on death, and to what extent did it motivate you?
Oh, great question. So I was terrified of death. And I remember this about a week or 2 before the accident. I would almost have panic attacks about it. I'd stop and I'd think, oh my God, I don't believe in an afterlife. I'm just going to be nothing someday. And this would terrify me. And, to the depths of my being. And oddly enough, it would happen at stoplights. And, like I died, at a red light, a yellow light that I turned red. And so when I would have these moments, I just brush it aside, like, oh, we'll make the most of life as you can. We don't really know what happens when we die. So as soon as I had the near-death experience, stepped out of form, I didn't even identify as much with this body. I identified with my spirit body probably more so than my body. And I looked at the physical body as it contains trauma that's still stored in it from childhood. It contains certain things, maybe memories from ancestors, but my consciousness is pure. My consciousness, was just there with God. And I knew that at some level, none of us can be hurt at that soul level, that no matter what happens here, we are so deeply loved, and it doesn't reach our soul necessarily, and that was a comfort. So yeah, I wasn't afraid of dying, and I even got that tested. How a lot of near-death experiencers say that they're not afraid, but many years later I was on a plane that basically we had to get in the crash position, and it felt like we were falling out of the sky. So we were falling at very, very fast rates. The guy next to me completely freaked out, was holding my hand. The woman next to me was holding my hand. He was screaming like, I have kids, I don't want to die. And I just said, all right, both of you, just focus on the light. We are so loved by God. Our spirits are probably not going to even feel this impact. We're just going to rise up out of our bodies and all be there in the light. Don't worry. And then at the last minute, one of the engines caught, and we landed in Spokane instead of Seattle. And it was this moment where I thought, well, I was really prepared to just leave. I mean, I had a couple of thoughts like, I thought I'd do more than this. I thought but maybe that was my mission, to teach a few junior high kids and high school kids, and that's it.
Now, Joseph has a question. I'm going to alter it slightly. So it said, after your experience, which was a spiritual quest, but did you have the impulse to go further into your spirituality?
My direct message from God was to work as a teacher and to remind students of their own light. However, when the psychic flashes started coming, when, I could meditate and leave my body and have out-of-body experiences, when these things happen, I felt weird, I felt like out of step with most of the people my age and in their 20s. And I was like, I need a shaman. I need, someone to guide me, to help me through this. This is a lot of information and a lot of new experiences. So I did, I met with shamans. I went on a few quests, in the Texas area. I started reading all about different spiritual traditions and of course, New Age teachers, that still are around today, Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson, and, all the big names, Wayne Dyer. And a lot of it just made sense to me, that especially this idea of the light body being something that lasts, or something that is more important than the physical body. I would say that it didn't take up a large portion of my life, but it was certainly an interest, just as much as literature was an interest. I think, spiritual literature started becoming an interest as well.
Now, skeptics can go as far as throwing science at you and brainwaves to just saying you're crazy. So how do you, for me, it's such a joy to talk to someone with a similar experience that I've had, because it's just like, the door is wide open and like someone gets it. But like, how do you deal with skeptics?
I say it's never too late for a near-death experience. You too can have one, and you too will die someday, and you'll know. And as a medium, I talk to many atheists over there who are really surprised at the reality of it. Who are really intensely surprised by this. But how I frame it is, basically, I say, look, I was much like you. And if I would have heard someone like me, I would have thought, oh, wow, is she from California? Does she have 2 feet in the sky? Like, she is really out there. Like, she seems happy, but not at all, like, believable. I think that, my agnostic self would not have connected with the person that I am now. So I understand that. All I can say is it changed me forever. And I think that's the hallmark of most spiritual experiences, is you never come back the same. And I I compare it to dreams, and dreams are something that is easy to tell the difference between. This reality was like a super, it's like something was imposed over this reality, making this reality look like a theater stage. So it really looked like what we're doing in the 3D here was just like a play or a stage that, everyone had on their body costumes, and we're here doing these things, but there's something working through us. There's something greater going on than we often understand. And the minute that veil was opened up for me, it's like you can't see you can't unsee this, that once it's opened, there's always going to be a crack. And there was a part of me that, I was 22 when I went back to college and just learned to walk again. I just wanted to be a regular young person, but I couldn't. Like I was so different. My brain was different. I was getting psychic flashes. And the best thing that I can compare it to is like being on mushrooms. And, but that first year or two afterwards, that's kind of how I felt. I just felt this oneness with nature, and trees talk to me and birds talk to me. And I know that that seems crazy, but people now are having experiences with hallucinogens that open them up to a spiritual reality. So who's to say that that just isn't a part of the brain that's open to a higher consciousness? But my brain was definitely open to a higher consciousness. And it's challenging for more left brain people to get into their intuition, but just about everyone has had some kind of spiritual experience. I would say that the hardcore atheists just describe it as something different, like a hormonal surge when they see their sweetheart for the first time, and they don't see it as like, oh, we're meeting from past lives, or, this is a soul destiny. They're just like hormones, but they still have some of those feelings, some of those same intuitions. And so some of it is just description, and some of it is maybe experience that they're just not open to.
Yeah, I always tell people it's like a dog whistle. Dogs can hear it, we can't. Imagine all of our senses being open to hearing and pulling in everything. But we got a great question from Stephanie. Do you believe each individual consciousness is immortal, or does it dissipate at a certain point or merge with a larger consciousness at a certain point? What do you think is your next phase would have been like if you had died? And do you think, wow, there's a lot of great questions in here. And do you think that that state would last forever?
Yeah, it was interesting. I have my theories about my own personal existence. I had some premonitions, and I actually chalked it up to psychotic breaks, really. But I had some premonitions that the near-death experience was coming, and I didn't like it. It terrified me, but I just saw myself dying. Like I saw a tombstone. I saw 72 to 94, the end, and so that terrified me. I thought it was because I was experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And so I quit, started running. My body got stronger. And I think my body being in a stronger state maybe survived that wreck, and maybe I wouldn't have survived it, before then. So if I would have died, I don't think I would have, sadly, completed anything that my soul wanted to do. And I think, honestly, it would have been a really quick return. It would have been a quick reincarnation. And I almost felt like I had maybe a couple of lives like that, maybe one before this, where it was, there was a theme of alcohol and drug abuse, at a young age, and just popped into this body. So I think maybe this time I was meant to talk to the youth about sobriety. It was meant to get it, myself on some level, and then change. And change is hard, but it's worthy. It's a worthy goal, to experience that spiritual healing from trauma and pass that on to others. So I think I would have reincarnated. I'm not opposed to reincarnating again. There's a lot of people on the spiritual path who are like, no, I'm not coming back. and yet, yeah, I think once you get over there in that space of eternity, if there's always something more, there's always a higher note, just like an opera or symphony that you can hit, and you're like, okay, I really want to knock it out of the park in this next life. Let's do it. And I think we get over there and we get healed, rejuvenated, and think, why not? Like I'll just carry more, I'll remember sooner. There's a lot of kids coming in with a lot of spiritual knowing. So maybe there's a choice to come back and participate with this. But I know it seems time over here seems so long, time over there seems so short. So that's another reason why I think a lot of people reincarnate, is because it over there, it just looks like, yeah, okay, you're there, you're back. Just not as big of a deal.
Not to disregard God's role in any of this, but did you have any control or feel you had any control about coming back to this physical form?
Nope. In fact, I was rebellious enough, and I don't know if I asked all of Stephanie's questions, answered all of Stephanie's questions. There were some good ones. Could you repeat it again?
Stephanie's questions? Okay. Do you feel each individual conscious is immortal, or does it dissipate at a certain point or merge with a larger consciousness at a certain point? What do you think your next phase would be like if you had died? So do you think that this state would last forever?
I've interviewed some near-death experiencers who remember some past lives as animals. And I found that fascinating, that there's like a memory of being a whale or being another consciousness. So I find that fascinating. Beyond a human on Earth, I mean, there's some people who believe they've been on other planets. There's a lot of experiences. I think I did feel individual but connected to the all, and I think that's a hard concept to explain. How can you understand everything or be one with everything and also retain your individuality? Well, I think it's your individuality connecting, just knowing that all exists. And then I do want to answer your question, Tim. Sorry, I got choked up.
Well, actually, I'm going to move one last question about near-death experiences. I want to talk about writing as well and your writing journey. So Lisa says, you mentioned God. Is that a function of your personal frame of reference, or does God present differently to someone with a different belief system, as perceived as, for example, Buddha, Allah, etc.?
Yeah, it's odd. And you can go to IANS. They have the most research on this, but there are, from what I've interviewed on my channel, there was one woman, Robin Lansong, who she was not raised in a Christian religion. She saw Shiva and Jesus and then a bright light. And she was, like there were just different people who or different avatars that came to her, to offer her strength and to offer her healing. A lot of near-death experiencers in the Western tradition have seen Jesus, but oddly, a lot of people like Muslims have seen Jesus and Jewish people have seen Jesus. And so there is some, there are some stories of that. The majority of near-death experiencers, from what I've read through IANS, which is the most comprehensive, don't necessarily see a religious figure. They see a light. And that gets translated into, well, is this the light of God? Is this Jesus? Is this just the light of universal consciousness? Is this God? To me, it felt like creator. It felt like God, and it felt powerful. And it didn't discredit any other religions. It just kind of seemed to be the overview of it all, God as the most powerful or as the most holy, in a sense.
So your writing journey now, were you always wanting to put out a book? Did your experience, and then you wrote Angels in the OR, did your experience say, I must write about this, or were you a writer before this? I know that you're a poet and you put out some poetry books as well.
Yeah, so poetry was a love, and that was a focus in graduate school. And I never really thought I'd write about the near-death experience until researchers started getting interested in it. And then I thought, okay, well, how is my story different? Eben Alexander put out a great book. There's been so many different people who've written about their near-death experience. Why do I need to? And so I just put it off. And it wasn't until National Geographic interviewed me that I thought, wow, National Geographic, that's a huge reach. Like, that's a magazine like that's interested in these experiences. Maybe science and religion are starting to come closer together, and maybe some of this is beginning to break down. And then then I also just thought, well, my experience as a young woman in this culture is different from a middle-aged neurosurgeon. Like he's going to have some privilege that I didn't have, and my journey, is going to be harder in many ways than his because of poverty, because of child abuse, and how does a near-death experience help with trauma before the NDE and trauma after the NDE? That was what I thought was worth talking about. And I felt for a long time that the part about suicidal idealization and depression, that there might be a spiritual answer to some of that. That certainly my near-death experience gave me a strength that I didn't have before to deal with depression. It didn't go away, but it certainly gave me this faraway perspective that allowed me to look at my life and have compassion for myself and go, oh, here's someone with brain chemistry who is suffering from depression. How do I help myself heal through this? How do I get through this, whether it's a week or a year? What's the trajectory doesn't matter. How do I work on healing?
So you've answered most of RJ's question here, but I'll ask the part that you didn't answer. Do you now have a greater sense of inner peace?
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. I wouldn't want to go back to myself pre-NDE for anything in the world there's only one benefit to not having the NDE. It was pretty tough at 21. So I had pretty tough boundaries with people. I just didn't have time for most people, and I would cut them off, and I kept myself really protected in a sense. And that was a blessing in some ways. Maybe that was like my upbringing and this kind of toughness of my personality, but I didn't have joy. I had a ton of self-absorbed, depressed, self-obsessive thoughts about, weight, what I'm eating, what I'm doing next, where I'm going, these people, where am I going to work, just like me, constantly, as I think a lot of people are. And the NDE just like shattered that I could really empathize with other people, and so much so that I lacked boundaries. That was this love that emanated from me, and I noticed that a lot of people were unhappy. So here I was, this 22-year-old girl back at college, smiling at everyone. How are you? How's it going? What are you up to? And, people would look at me sometimes like, oh, it's morning. Shut up. You're too much. And so there was this humor that I had about it, that I understood that I was full of joy. And even the worst possible moments. So even deep trauma, I write about, sexual assault in a foreign country, which that's like high level trauma. To not get justice, to only I think female veterans have that same level of trauma that I have. And I think it certainly took a toll, 20-year toll, but it also showed me that I can see energy bodies. I could see myself. I knew how I had to begin that healing journey, and I wanted to offer that knowledge to others. So I'd say, from what I observe from people who've been through my level of trauma, I think I could have been a whole lot worse off had I not had the near-death experience. That it certainly offered healing and a lot more joy. But we're human near-death experiencers, without a doubt. Very human.
Now, the book itself, you had stated that you wish it had more mass appeal. Like, why doesn't everyone pick this up? Like Frank McCourt's book, I think you quoted as saying, The Teacher Man, his book. So is that the writer in you? Is that the ego in you? What explain that? And I don't mean that as a negative.
No.
That question may have come across as negative, just
It doesn't come across as negative. I think it can be the soul part of us too that longs for greatness. Like a musician wants to like hit it out of the park and create a beautiful song. A writer wants to create something that's lasting, or something that's beautiful, or something that just really touches the hearts of people. And so part of that ego is necessary, I think, for an artist. But then the other part of it, in many ways, I wish I hadn't had this mindset of I have to tell this specific story with a bit about, I guess, some of the anger and depression. I processed some of the anger and depression in the book. And now, many years after writing the book, I kind of feel a lot more healed from it. And I hate that idea that writing can be therapy, but I think it was like that last piece of therapy for me, because there's this greater forgiveness, there's this greater oneness, there's this greater, like, oh, it's just my story. Like, I'll give you an example. I was sitting in a college classroom recently, and I was thinking about, women's rights around the world has always mattered to me. And then it just kind of hit me. I was like, I just want peace and justice for all. I just want, healing for all, and everyone's issue matters to me as much as my own, as much as it can. Like, there was a deep personalization of this lifetime, and really just this wish for more healing in society, whether it's addiction, whether it's depression, whether it's, suicidal idealization, whatever the problem is. Anxiety seems to be the biggest problem now. Like, I want healing for that. Like, there's just so many ways that people can hurt, and I would like for more healing to be available.
It seems like part of that solution is just everyone should have more love and kindness. Why can't society today embrace love and kindness?
Online, in groups like this, it's possible, but if I made some post that was slightly political or slightly, off-putting to one of you in some way or another, it's really easy to anonymously just jab at someone, or to just say something. And so I don't think the internet, and we aren't taught etiquette or netiquette as kids, and maybe some schools are now, but like, just go back in time. Imagine a narcissistic person, we'll say man, because if you go way back in time, that would be the only person who'd be at a pub, but most likely. But just imagine someone drinking at a pub, and he's narcissistic and mean to some of the staff, and then he comes home and is mean to his wife and kids. He doesn't have a computer outlet to go and spew hate everywhere, just like, it's kind of localized to that community. And I think now we just have this opportunity for more hate to be thrown out there, but we do have an opportunity for love to spread. I just think that social media platforms prioritize what's shocking or what's hateful or what's fearful. And until they start changing it, or people just disconnect, and sometimes the technology is stronger than them, and sometimes you make a living through being online, and it's difficult to totally disconnect. But I think people are in small groups very loving, and I think that the great healing of the divide in America, I see it every day in my community college classrooms, is, a student might be vastly different from me politically, but they love me and I love them. Like, there's just no hatred. Like, you can love everyone when they're right in front of you, but when they are just an idea connected to another idea, you can disagree so vehemently you think you hate that person, but you don't.
Now, are you working on something new? Do you have another book going on?
I'm working on a young adult novel, but it's odd. In the middle of writing this, I scrapped it, and I think I'm going to write to kids. I think I'm going to write children's books. And so that's what feels right. I might return to this young adult novel because I've been playing around with it in my head for a long time. It's kind of to those junior high kids that were a mess that I worked with.
And final question. You said that, obviously you're very spiritual, but you said that atheists and agnostics really enjoyed the part about your father's death. Now, why is that?
Well, everyone goes through grief and loss. And so I think their minds are pretty shut to my near-death experience. They're like, that's just her brain shutting down. I know that she believes that's true. But when they get to my father dying and that relationship, and how it translated into a deeper love and a deeper understanding even after death, I think there's something sentimental, that comes out in people around losing their parents. It's a big milestone. It's a deep and painful thing, even when you're not close to the parent. But most people are close to their parents to some degree. And so that's just a way to connect, I think, with that group. And you would think that it would be easier to connect with religious people, but it depends. Like the Catholics and the Methodists and the Unitarians are pretty open to me, largely. The evangelicals are not. I mean, like if there's one group of people that's come after me hardcore, it's definitely been evangelicals, because they'll stop and they're just angry that I didn't see Jesus and that I have some kind of reach or influence, and they really come after me.
All right, well, we've run out of time. In fact, we went over time, and that's my
Oh, no.
fault, because I'd stay on for 3 hours, but you know what? That's not what I do. That's not my role here. But I do want everyone to check out Angels in the OR. And this is Tricia's memoir, and it explains nearly everything that we've talked about tonight. And again, go to her page. There it is. It's a lovely book, a lovely cover, and I wish you great success with the book and continuing to do what you're doing. I think it's wonderful, and I so appreciate you being here and talking about all this stuff.
Yeah, and there's lots of interviews out there. Shaman Oak's page does really good interviews. So if you just want to check out an interview of the full, I didn't explain my near-death experience, but if you haven't heard it, go Google him, and one of my shorter interviews, I sum it up.
And for other experiences, Tricia's YouTube page has so many interviews, so check that out. Folks that are watching this live streamed on Facebook, we will have an open mic, so if you want to hit the link, and I hope you didn't ask a lot of questions there on Facebook because I can't see them. So if you want to hit the link and come on in, I'll let you in. Tricia, thank you once more, and it's great having you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fun event.